Hi, everybody, and welcome to the last lecture in our lecture series that is dedicated to Assyrian history, culture, and language. And again, we would like to thank the generous donation that made this talk possible. Today, we're particularly delighted because we're introducing one of our own, Joseph Hermes. Joseph is a PhD student at the Center for Middle East, at the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations. He started his career as an MA student at CMES, at the center that organizes this lecture series, writing a wonderful MA thesis about the ways in which Assyrians were engaged in both Ottoman reforms, but also in how Assyrian intellectuals, one in particular, facilitated the study of modern Assyriology and some of the things that we see today in the British Museum through their own investigations, through their own initiatives. So it was a fascinating project on how Westernization, Ottoman politics of reform actually influenced the community, and I hope that he publishes it soon. He is now a PhD student at the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilization, working with sources in Assyrian, in Aramaic, in and also in a variety of Middle Eastern languages, in particular Arabic and Ottoman Turkish. And his project focuses in particular on the diasporic Assyrian press. So what happens to Assyrian newspapers when they begin to be published outside of the regions where Assyrians resided in the past, where there are diasporas all over the Middle East, but in particular in the United States. And his project is, I think, the first exploration, at least in the history of sort of the realities of post-World War, on how the Assyrians kind of view, but also debate their identity through a series of publications. So I can testify from my field, which is Iraqi studies, but also in the field of sort of post-World War mandate Middle Eastern studies, that people are really eager to read what Joe has to say about this, because this is kind of the first attempt to uncover different vision of statehood and nationalism and homeland after the travesties of the First World War. So I have to say again, as people in the field of Middle Eastern studies, we're very excited about the project, but I'm also super excited that he's here with you today to share some of the insights from the project, part of which is actually part of the sources for which are actually in the Ashurbanipal library. So thank you again for the kind donation. Thank you again for a wonderful lecture series from which I personally, but also a lot of our members who are not members of the community have learned so much. And thank you, Joseph, for delivering the final lecture. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Professor Bashkin. And again, I really do want to thank the Center for Middle Eastern Studies, Tom, Krishna, the entire staff for helping to facilitate this lecture series so successfully. I also want to reiterate a thanks to the generous donors who made it possible. And last but not least, I really want to thank everyone who's joined us here today. I really appreciate all of you taking an interest in this lecture series and in my topic in particular today. And I really do look forward to having a very fruitful discussion at the end. So without further ado, I will go ahead and share my slide now so we can get this started. Okay, so the United States v. Shmuel David, Racializing Assyrians in Post-World War I America. In this talk, I would like to start by positing that Assyrian identity, particularly the variety expressed popularly in the United States in the early 20th century, is inextricably linked to the history of the racialization of communities in the US, a process which itself dates back to the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and it has historical antecedents even further back than that, possibly. Rather than focus on assimilation as a meta-narrative of the Assyrian immigrant experience, I want to instead focus on racialization or ethnicization, where in the construction of peoplehood, or in this particular topic, Assyrian identity, is formed vis-a-vis outsiders, so other communities living among the Syrians, especially here in the United States. Now, of course, I do want to sort of preface that racial labels are oftentimes tools that render cultural, linguistic, religious, and political diversity invisible and simultaneously stir up differences between groups. Racial categories both flatten histories. So, for example, the all-encompassing term of Caucasian, oftentimes disguises the migrant histories of people that use that label or identify with that label. And oftentimes racial categories also stoke differences. So, for example, Asian American, African American, these terms in many ways highlight the foreign roots of the communities that identify with these labels. The formulation and articulation of Assyrian identity in the 20th century has been studied by scholars through the lens of missionary encounter, education, urbanism, capitalism, humanitarianism. But scholars have overlooked the history of racialization of Assyrians and its impact on their contemporary self-understanding. More specifically, I would argue that Assyrian ethnicity in the United States was formed by these racializing forces and processes within American politics, culture, and law. This talk will only briefly explore how Assyrians came to think of themselves along racial lines and position themselves within racial hierarchies. Through excavation of legal and newspaper sources, we can begin to uncover the history of how Assyrians living in the United States at the turn of the 20th century self-imagined and positioned themselves as quote-unquote white persons in American society, and how that process in turn influences contemporary Assyrian identity. In October of 1924, Reverend Samuel David, the resident Chaldean Catholic priest for the Catholic Assyrian community in Chicago, and a popular Assyrian writer, found himself embroiled in a legal challenge for his US citizenship. The resulting case, the United States v. Shmuel David, was brought before the court to determine if Assyrians were in fact white persons and thus eligible for US citizenship. The resulting case that unfolded between February and October of 1924 would hold historical significance for future citizenship cases among Assyrians. Reverend David's case is one example within a broader history of Assyrian self-imagination and positioning within Western racial hierarchies starting in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The David decision, which did ultimately uphold Reverend David's citizenship, has not yet been studied and serves as an appropriate avenue into studying the larger history of racial dynamics among Assyrians in the United States and its impact on Assyrian identity today. Bring you a little bit back to American history. So the 14th Amendment of the Constitution declared that all persons born within the United States to be US citizens, and worked to, and sort of the Naturalization Bureau that was created in the 19th century worked to bestow citizenship on freedmen, but also aliens within the United States as well. Congress went further. They amended the naturalization requirements in 1870 and extended naturalization eligibility to, quote, aliens being free white persons, and to aliens of African nativity, and to persons of African descent, end quote. US courts' opinions on who was and was not considered white and therefore eligible for citizenship differed over time. The Naturalization Act of 1906 placed the Bureau of Immigration and Naturalization in charge of all matters concerning the naturalization of aliens, with the general purpose of promoting uniform naturalization practices nationwide. While this seemed like a clear mission, the law created much confusion as to the race question. Following the Supreme Court decisions of Sakawa Azawa v. United States in 1922 and United States v. Bhagat Singh Thind in 1923, Asians were stripped of their citizenship retroactively, and quote-unquote Asiatic populations, which was sort of a catch-all term for anyone who wasn't from East Asia or South Asia today, so primarily people of Arab, Armenian, and Assyrian descent, were threatened by this same fate. In his very important book, White by Law, The Legal Construction of Race, Ian Haney Lopez concluded that US courts often applied two different tests when determining citizenship cases. One he called the common knowledge, and then the other the scientific evidence rationale. but they applied these standards quite inconsistently in determining who was and was not considered white and therefore eligible for citizenship. In Ozawa, the court relied on scientific evidence that Takawa Ozawa, a California businessman of Japanese descent, could not be considered Caucasian. He was therefore not white and ineligible for citizenship. Whereas the Thing Court, not even a year later, jettisoned the scientific rationale and held that while Indians could be considered Caucasian, because they were not considered white among the common man or person on the street, they were not truly white. Bhagat Singh Thind, the defendant in the case, was a Sikh born in India who immigrated to the United States in 1913. He completed his PhD at the University of California, and he served in the US Army during World War I and was honorably discharged. After his citizenship was granted in Oregon, US attorneys mounted a successful case stripping him of his citizenship. The decision led to the denaturalization of Japanese, Indian, and other Asian immigrants in the United States. The court reasoned in the Thind case that, quote, "It may be true that the blonde Scandinavian and the brown Hindu have a common ancestor in the dim reaches of antiquity. The average man knows perfectly well that there are unmistakable and profound differences between them today," end quote. Ozawa, Thind, and other cases that excluded Asian immigrants from naturalization, the United States attempted to prevent and even revoke the citizenship of Asiatic immigrants. This is all to show that there was a concerted effort by the US government, particularly in the post-World War I period, to block immigrants from becoming US citizens, as well as to curb future immigration almost entirely. While Assyrians might have imagined themselves to be operating on the margins or outside the purview of these important decisions, the David case would bring it home quite impactfully. Now, Reverend Shmuel David's professional journey mirrored that of many other young Assyrian men from Iran in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. They studied in Christian missionary schools, and if they excelled, they were sent off to Europe or to the US for further studies before returning home to Iran to teach in missionary schools and serve local parishes. Reverend David was born in the village of Gavilan, just outside of Urmia, Iran, in 1872. He was educated in France and ordained to the priesthood in 1896. However, with the rapidly growing Assyrian community in Chicago, he was sent to the US to serve the Assyrian Catholic community. In 1913, he became pastor of St. Ephraim's Church in Chicago, the first Chaldean Catholic parish in the United States, and a parish which is still in operation today. It's located over on Bryn Mawr and Lincoln Avenue on the north side of the city. By the early 1900s, there were several thousand Assyrians residing in the US. Like Armenian and Syrian Arab communities, Assyrian immigrants came to the US in pursuit of economic and educational opportunities or to escape persecution in their homelands. As Assyrian colonies started to form in places throughout the Midwest and East Coast, Assyrians established social organizations and churches to serve the community's needs. Assyrian clergymen of Church of the East, Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestant training arrived to service the spiritual needs of the Assyrian community. The picture you see here is a group of young Assyrian men outside the LaSalle Avenue Baptist Church, which was an early gathering place for many Assyrian immigrants in the US in the early 1900s. Iranian Assyrians established communities in Chicago, New Britain, Hartford, Connecticut, Yonkers, New York, Elizabeth, New Jersey, Philadelphia, Flint, Michigan, Gary, Indiana, and Turlock, California. Assyrian immigrants brought with them ideas about nationhood and a culture of print journalism inculcated at the missionary schools in Iran to the US. The image you see here is of the Carter Presbyterian Church, which was the first Assyrian building built and owned by the Assyrian community. It was built in 1906. It was located at 54 West Huron Street, and the building was there for quite a long time until it was recently actually demolished a couple of years ago, and a nice big condo building was actually thrown up in its place, but sort of speaks to the early Assyrian presence in the city of Chicago. So And here you have a picture of Assyrians in, I believe this is Worcester, Massachusetts, at a 4th of July parade in 1919, 1920. The arrival of American missionaries into the Ottoman Empire and Qajar Iran in the 1830s brought not only greater attention to the condition of Christian communities in that part of the world, but it also brought with it schools and access to travel circuits abroad. Fervent missionary activity also resulted in new literary production among Iranian Assyrians in the Urmia region of northwestern Iran. Assyrian students in Iran learned English and were exposed to popular Orientalist narratives about the Middle East and about their own community within the missionary schools. Ideas of racial hierarchies were also an ever-present reality in American Christian missionary schools in Urmia, which was one of the birthplaces, or quote-unquote birthplaces, of Assyrian ethno-nationalism in the 19th century. Thus, the process of racialization, or ascribing racial identities to a group that did not identify itself as such, began not in the US, but among Assyrians in missionary schools in Iran. As an article in the science section of Rays of Light, or Zahir al-Bahra, which was an Assyrian newspaper that was published in Iran, was the first Assyrian newspaper, I think, to be published in the Middle East overall, starting in 1850, and it lasted, well through a good part of World War I. And the image you see here is actually a copy of it. But in the science section of Rays of Light, there was an article published in the December 1850 issue that I think sort of speaks to ideas of race and the racialization of the community. And I will quote from that here. The anonymous author writes, the European race's minds are loftier than those of the other races for several reasons. The greatest reason of all is true Christianity, which has so awakened and sharpened the mind of white people. But it is necessary that we sow seeds of Christianity in the hearts of all nations, or millete. As much as we are able to do so, and then gray people, red people, and black people will mix with one another and also with white people who have more abundant mental gifts, until all of them learn and confess that God created all the nations of human beings from one blood, end quote. The anonymous Assyrian author of this piece emphasizes an ideal Christian universalism, but cannot escape the fact that they're affirming the superiority of the white race. Perhaps the clearest example of how novel ideas of race and civilization played out in the Middle East was through Orientalist narratives authored by missionary-educated Assyrians in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The commercial appeal of Orientalist narratives of the Middle East opened pathways for Assyrians to promote their own self-imagination to Western audiences. Adam Becker, for example, notes in his book, Revival and Awakening, American Evangelical Missionaries in Iran and the Origins of Assyrian Nationalism, that Isaac Malik Yonan, a prominent Iranian Assyrian intellectual in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, returned home to Urmia from the US in 1899 with copies of George Hughes Hepworth's Through Armenia on Horseback, published in 1898, and Samuel G. Wilson's Persian Life and Customs, with scenes and incidents of residence and travel in the land of the lion and the sun. Assyrian Orientalist writers asserted in their works, oftentimes implicitly, that their commonalities lied not with other peoples of Middle Eastern descent, but with their white European and American audiences. At the turn of the 20th century, Assyrian writers and intellectuals began composing their own narratives of the Orient and became cultural brokers of the Middle East for white audiences in Europe and North America. Hormuz Rassam, a Chaldean Catholic Assyrian from Mosul, who famously assisted Austin Henry Layard with his excavations at Nineveh in the 1840s, and later led an extravagant career as a diplomat and archaeologist for the British government, wrote numerous works on the archaeology and peoples of the Middle East, his most famous work being Ashur and the Land of Nimrod, published in 1897, a memoir of his activities and encounters in the region. Protestant-educated Assyrian ministers from Iran also wrote memoirs on life and customs in Persia, oftentimes while they worked or studied abroad in the United States or Europe. Joseph Khnanishu, for example, a missionary-educated Assyrian of the Church of the East, writes in the preface to his book About Persia and Its People, published in 1899, that Quote, while on lecture tours in this country, I have been asked many questions about the manners, customs, and peculiarities of my own people, the Nestorian Christians of Persia, called by their scholars Assyrian Christians, and abbreviated by the people into Syrians. Hence this book, which I now present to the public with the earnest hope that it may find a welcome. Isaac Adams, a charismatic Protestant ordained Assyrian minister, wrote 2 books on Persia, Darkness and Daybreak, published in 1898, and Persia by a Persian, published in 1900, before establishing an Assyrian colony in Turlock, California. Assyrian Orientalist writers projected themselves as mirror images of the missionaries who worked among them, engaged in the hopes of converting the quote-unquote Mohammedan nations, and drawing clear distinctions between their own people and Turkish, Kurdish, and Arab Muslims. These narratives would take on a new form following the Assyrian genocide of 1915 and onwards. Harrowing massacres and deportations destroyed ancient Assyrian communities in the Ottoman Empire and Iran. Many of the destitute genocide survivors were stranded in refugee camps in Hamadan, Iran, Tiflis, Georgia, and most infamously in Bakuba, Iraq in 1919. Ottoman Turkish forces and allied Kurdish tribes subjected hundreds of thousands of Assyrians to a systematic campaign of violence, both in the Ottoman Empire and in the Iranian theater of the war. This campaign of violence, deportation, expulsion resulted in the destruction of historic Assyrian villages, churches, and other heritage sites. Assyrian political delegations to the Paris Peace Conference and subsequent peace meetings seeking to remedy these injustices presented Assyrians as a clearly identifiable Christian nation, loyal to the allies and enemies of Muslim Arabs and Turks alike. A people uniquely capable of developing any territory they would be given by Western powers. Laura Robson, who we had the pleasure of hearing from a few months ago for this lecture series, has touched upon these themes in her book, States of Separation, Transfer, Partition, and the Making of the Modern Middle East. Post-World War I Assyrian American activists drew upon standard diaspora claims that, quote, reflected the anxieties and needs of a diaspora community trying to demonstrate its whiteness, Christianity, and civilization in the context of an often xenophobic and hostile host country, end quote. Nevertheless, the Assyrians' appeals to Christian civilization and their self-positioning in contradistinction from Muslims and promotion of their allegiance to the Allied cause during World War I, Assyrians living in the US could not escape their classification as in quote-unquote Asiatic race and their eligibility for citizenship and their eligibility for naturalization and the corresponding economic and social benefits which that would entail stood on shaky ground. Reverend David's case was not, in fact, the first case where an Assyrian's pursuit of citizenship, inextricably linked to the pursuit of whiteness, was challenged. Cases in Indiana, California, Washington, and Louisiana document Assyrian attempts at obtaining U.S. citizenship. In some of these cases, the writers appear to conflate Syrians with Assyrians, a problem for any Assyrian today, I'm sure undoubtedly we've encountered. The former being an all-encompassing term in the early 20th century for people who originated from the Levant. Syrians, according to Sarah Galtieri in her very important book, Between Arab and White, wrote that Syrians, or Arabs from the present-day Levant, represented 1/3 of all citizenship cases heard in the United States federal courts between 1909 and 1923. I just want to sort of spend a second here looking at some of these newspaper clips. They're actually quite interesting. Now, some cases it appears they're talking about not necessarily Syrians, but nonetheless, it sort of affects all of these communities pretty much the same. When Reverend David came before the Cook County District Court in 1923 for his initial citizenship hearing, he was already a prominent member of the Assyrian community in Chicago. I mentioned earlier that he was an active minister for his parish and a well-known Assyrian writer. He wrote and published 7 or 8 books in the years from 1923 until his death in 1930, and contributed regularly to the Assyrian American Herald, published in Chicago during the 1910s and 20s. Initially, the Cook County District Court granted Reverend David citizenship during his naturalization hearing on November 8, 1923. This was 9 months after the Thin decision. In the government's bill of complaint filed in February of 1924, Reverend David was referred to as a person of primarily Asiatic stock and is not an alien-free white person or an alien of African nativity or a person of African descent, end quote. U.S. Attorney Edwin A. Olson, the lead government attorney in the case, acknowledged in his complaint that Reverend David was, quote, a man of good education, character, and attainments, and that the only objection to his becoming a citizen is on account of race, end quote. Additionally, Fred J. Schlotfeld, the chief naturalization examiner of the 6th Naturalization District of the Department of Labor, which encompassed Cook County at that time, provided an affidavit for the government stating that Reverend David was granted citizenship in 1923 over the objections of the government that he was, quote, not an alien-free white person or an alien of African nativity or a person of African descent within the meaning of Section 2169 of the Revised Statutes of the United States, end quote. And Schlotfeld held that Reverend David was a, quote, person of primarily Asiatic stock, and that therefore the certificate of citizenship issued to him was illegally procured, end quote. In his answer to the government's bill of complaint, Reverend David, through his attorneys, denied that he was a person of, quote unquote, Asiatic stock, and that he was indeed a, quote, alien-free white person, end quote, under the meaning of Section 2169 of the Revised Statutes. Ultimately, Judge James Wilkerson, the official presiding over the case, dismissed the government's complaint in favor of Reverend David. While we lack the official decision in the court dossier, we are fortunate enough to read about the decision as it was carried over the press wire in the U.S. U.S. press wire stories describe the David decision as a quote-unquote test case undertaken by the U.S. government to determine whether Assyrians could be considered white persons. Albert H. Putney, a prominent attorney and chief of the Near Eastern Division of the Department of State and the dean of the School of Diplomacy and Jurisprudence of the American University in D.C., was recruited as one of Reverend David's attorneys in the case. In the Wednesday, October 8, 1924 edition of the Evening Star, a Washington, D.C., a defunct Washington, D.C. Based newspaper, under the title Plea for Assyrians, Putney's trip to Chicago for the case was one which had, quote, great interest attached to this test case as it involves all other Assyrians now in this country, end quote. Ultimately, Reverend David's citizenship was upheld, and 20 years later, long after Reverend David had passed the episode, long after Reverend David had passed, the episode was recounted in a Chicago Tribune article. In December 1944, the Tribune ran a story commemorating the 25th anniversary of the Assyrian Congregational Church of Chicago. This was a parish that was led by the Reverend Paul Newey, a very prominent Assyrian minister and activist in Chicago from the early 1900s until his death in 1960. Aside from his reputation as an Assyrian newspaper publisher and congregational minister, the Tribune writer noted that Newey had, quote, helped thousands pass naturalization examinations, end quote, and that he had assisted Reverend David fight his test case in 1924. Now, the article claims that it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and I never found any sort of evidence for that, but it certainly was heard here in Chicago, obviously, and its memory sort of stuck out. And for those who are somewhat familiar with the Assyrian community of Chicago, Reverend Newey's church, for those who ever had a chance to visit it, which used to be on the north side of the city, now they're out in the suburbs, actually has a plaque sort of commemorating the thousands of people that he helped pass citizenship cases during his tenure. So it was something that definitely remained an important point that Reverend Newey sort of focused on. And I think it sort of goes very, very much back to this case in 1924. The David case reveals that the US government's campaign to strip Reverend David of his citizenship was a part of a larger program, I would say rooted very much in white supremacy, initiated against perceived non-white and undesirable immigrant communities in the US. 2 years earlier, in a letter titled Assyrian Immigration and dated May 1st, 1922, and published on June 4th, 1922 in the New York Times, Paul Shomon, an Assyrian activist and minister from Iran residing in the United States since the 1890s, wrote that in the matter of immigration, there was an unintentional injustice to the Assyrians, which has been hardly realized by American lawmakers. Under the Emergency, end quote, under the Emergency Quota Act, effective May 19, 1921, introduced numerical limits on immigration and established that only 2% of the number of residents from any country now living in the United States as of the 1910 census. This left Assyrians living in refugee camps in the Middle East with no path to immigration to the United States. Shimon pleaded sympathetically to his white American audience to consider the difficulties the act had on Assyrians. Quote, here is a situation in the case of Assyrians and Armenians as well, hardly paralleled in history, Shimon wrote. These people have shed their blood and have suffered the most sublime martyrdom of any age, due in 90 cases out of 100 due to their sympathy and stand with the Allied cause, end quote. Historians and scholars working on Assyrians, as I mentioned, have really overlooked the history of racialization of Assyrians and its impact on their contemporary self-understanding. The history of Assyrians' attempts to situate themselves culturally and legally within white mainstream American society and gain the acceptance and support of a white American audience mirrored their attempts to fit into the international society in the post-World War I period. Assyrians proved their ability to perform their white identity as evidenced through their economic success and their Christian background, which played favorably in civilizational arguments of their whiteness. This is very much the same case with Arab immigrants, Armenian immigrants. I mean, the stories are almost identical. Assyrians in many ways are still driven by the expectation that their Christian background and solidarity with the West will be rewarded with their protection in the homeland. This prayer-like approach, as Mardin Isaac, an Assyrian writer, terms it, has entrapped Assyrians within systems of appeal and recourse to Western powers. The narrative of the Assyrian immigrant experience as a success story, much in the same way we hear about the Arab, Jewish, Italian, Irish immigrant success story, was a useful historical narrative encountering claims of people of Middle Eastern origin being foreign and unassimilable. However, it failed to describe the broader implications of claiming whiteness. Today, Assyrians and other Middle Eastern communities in the United States are not officially recognized as minority communities, yet they are situated outside of white majority society. And I would even take it a step further in the Assyrian case. Now, obviously, we're hearing about the release of census data for 2020. And interestingly enough, there's been a push within the Assyrian community to be able to sort of break out of the very stringent sort of racial categories that exist on the census application. I know members of other Middle Eastern communities as well have sort of lobbied for the creation of a MENA category as well. And I think interestingly enough, in the Assyrian case, Assyrians are more or less legally considered white within this country, but the overwhelming majority of the Assyrian population in the United States today are primarily immigrants who have come to this country within the last 30, maybe even 40 years, but predominantly people who came to in the 1980s and 1990s and now in the post-Iraq war and post-Syrian conflict. So, I mean, it sort of, I think, speaks to questions of legitimacy of these sort of racial categories and what they actually mean and the power that they hold. So that concludes my presentation. I want to thank everyone again. And like I said, I really look forward to a fruitful discussion on this topic.
Thank you. I want to open it up for a question, but actually, since it was so, can you hear me well?
Yes.
Since it was so fascinating, I'll take the prerogative to ask the first question. So as a comment, I think it's interesting that this is, as you noted at the end, this is a time where a lot of immigrants to the United States from Irish people to Sephardi Jews are kind of trying to figure out and trying to show that they're white. But I was wondering if in any of the deliberations there was more emphasis on the language that the Assyrians spoke, that they spoke a Semitic language, and whether, quote unquote, it was used against them, or that their Christianity kind of toppled the Semitic component of their language and culture. And my second question is about whether we have data on, how much this immigration policies that you talked about, that the Reverend encountered and so forth, actually damaged the community in the sense of like people not getting citizenship, survivors of genocide being left in the Middle East. So from your research, what do we know about sort of the broader implications of these politics?
Well, the Quota Act that was passed in 1921, and then I believe it was the Johnson and Reed Act in 1924, which became even more stringent. I think that even pushed back the quota not to the 1910 census, but I think to the 1890 census. In 1890, I mean, there were probably only a handful of Assyrians in the United States, so that almost blocked out the community, any members of the community, of ever dreaming of immigrating to the United States. And I think, I mean, it's very well detailed. There's actually a story that I came across. I think it's on the Ellis Island. There's a blog for the Ellis Island, I think it's the foundation. And it's actually a story of an Assyrian who, I'm sorry, it was the Angel Island. So this is out in San Francisco, of an Assyrian who was blocked by the quota law. So this is an Assyrian genocide survivor who's coming to the United States to join his brother, arrives in San Francisco and is turned away because he arrived after the passage of the, of the quota law. So, yeah, I mean, it definitely curtailed immigration more or less of Assyrians into the United States for quite some time. Oftentimes, I mean, just sort of anecdotally talking to much older first generation, second generation Assyrians, oftentimes what was the case is they would just go back to the homeland, especially young men. They would get married and they'd bring their wives over. So that was really the only sort of form of immigration that we can sort of come across. Of course, there were some exceptions for people who were fleeing as refugees and whatnot. I mean, we do have evidence of some of them being admitted, but more or less, there was a very tight sort of policy in terms of Assyrian immigration to the US, which was already not a very large population to begin with. So yeah, I mean, it definitely had a very powerful effect. But I would argue that the power of newspaper culture sort of connected these communities. So while borders may have been shut off, the circulation of Assyrian newspapers in the United States was a very powerful tool to communicate what was happening, globally for Assyrians.
Yeah, and the language issue?
Yeah, so I've never come across anything about sort of, I guess anything about their sort of Semitic or perceived Semitic identity. Oftentimes, the concept of like the Assyrians being an ancient Christian nation, I think, played very popularly with American audiences, and quite sympathetically as well. So oftentimes, I think it actually served. Although I think it's illusory. I mean, there were obviously some help and aid that was provided because of that idea, but ultimately was really unsuccessful in achieving real success, at least measurable by what the community was asking for at the time.
No, then I'd like to end by saying that I want to thank Joe again. I mean, it's always good to have a student who is a walking encyclopedia, and I can say that Joe is certainly the case beyond sort of his analysis and his insights. So I'd like to thank him for ending this lecture series by reminding us that actually a lecture series that started in the Middle East, in the Ottoman Empire, in Iran, and in Iraq also has a lot to say about the United States, and reminding us of these connections. Again, we'd like to extend our thanks to the Assyrian Universal Alliance and the gracious donors for allowing us to have these conversations. We will continue them next year, part in Zoom, part in person. And we are delighted that members of the community joined us. We're delighted that the speakers came. And again, we very much hope that next year we will see you in person in our center. Um, and I thank you all for devoting your attention and your time and your space to listening to this Silence Voices and this fascinating history. And I wish you that you enjoy the rest of the spring quarter. And thank you so much again for coming. And thank you, Joe, for putting the thank you in so many languages, in 2 languages that are crucial to this lecture series. So thank you all very much.